Hey guys, it's Miss Osborne coming to you live from my couch with the first set of North Carolina final exam review videos. Okay, so we're looking at the New South and the Old West, the period from 1865 to about 1900. Okay, so as you watch the video, a couple things that I want you to do. Okay, answer the guided questions that are provided. You may need to pause the video or rewatch it in order to get some of the finer answers, and that's totally okay. I want you to stop it as you need to. Okay, when the video ends, go ahead and summarize the video in paragraph form using the main points that were provided. I'm going to give you some specific vocabulary to look at on your WSQ. Mainly it's going to be the bolded and underlined words. Okay, and then I also want you to finish by asking one question. Okay, and this question can either be something that you're still confused about, or you may ask a discussion question or a question that you think that I would bring to the table. Okay, so a couple essential questions before we begin. One, how did Reconstruction change the way that African Americans were treated in the South? And then how did the movement of people westward represent the American dream for whites, African Americans, and Native Americans? These two questions should be answered in your summary. So after Reconstruction, African Americans in the South were suffering from policies that were set in place by Democratic Republicans. Okay? They were hoping to confine African Americans in a system very similar to slavery through black codes and Jim Crow laws. Now, the Democratic Republicans will eventually become what we call the Democratic Party. Okay? The Democratic Party had really taken over the South after Reconstruction. It was what we call the Southern Democrats. They were the conservatives and will eventually become what we know today to be the Republican Party. Okay, so back to black codes and Jim Crow laws. Black codes were laws that placed limitations on economic and social opportunities for African Americans. Okay, it forced them to work in conditions that were very similar to slavery. Black codes were what came after slave codes. Okay, and slave codes were passed during slavery that would limit African Americans' freedoms. Okay, Jim Crow laws were slightly different than black codes because these laws were what legalized the separation of African Americans and whites in society. Okay, and Jim Crow laws were upheld by the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, and in this court case, the Supreme Court upheld a decision that approved separate but equal facilities for African Americans. Now, the separate but equal is the most important part that you need to remember. Okay, and this is referring to any public accommodations, right? Movie theaters, restaurants, hotels. Schools is going to be the main one that we see it relate to when we get to Brown versus Board of Education in the 1960s that actually got rid of the separate but equal ruling. Okay? Southern legislatures also wanted to disenfranchise, and disenfranchise means to take away the right to vote. Okay? So Southern legislatures wanted to take away the right to vote from African Americans, right? And they did this through three main ways. Literacy tests, which required African Americans to take a test on whether or not they could read. Poll taxes, which also would limit the amount of poor white voters in the South. And the grandfather clause that said that if your grandfather could not vote before a certain date, then you could not vote. And essentially was saying if your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. Okay, and because of this, a lot of African Americans end up moving to the north in what we call the Great Migration, or to the west in order to escape the discrimination that's going on in the South. Okay, there's a couple of different African American leaders that emerge as a part of this movement. The main one that you need to remember is Booker T. Washington. Okay, and Booker T. Washington is a very interesting figure because he calls on African Americans to seek economic opportunities rather than political rights. He did not think that immediate equality was the answer to the way that African Americans were being treated. Okay, he supports the idea that African Americans should rely on themselves rather than whites, particularly what he called the talented 10th, the top 10% of African Americans in society that would rise up and help the African American people rise in society above whites. Okay, he also established vocational schools, and vocational schools are these schools in which African Americans could go to be taught trades such as farming or other trades like that. Vocational schools are still around today. Okay, he also establishes a couple different universities in the South, and he supports this idea that education is going to be the way in which African Americans would rise economically and also inequality to whites. Okay, so the Transcontinental Railroad was one of the main things that occurred in the 1860s that changed American life. And the Transcontinental Railroad was actually approved under Lincoln, but it's not built until 1869. The Transcontinental Railroad is important because it's built mainly by Irish and Chinese workers, so mainly immigrants. Okay? And as the East Coast people and the East Coast started feeling like, the population was increasing too much, there wasn't enough space to move around, they start traveling along the railroad. Okay? Many of them were going to be farmers. Some of them are going to be coming for the mining boom that occurred in California and in the Midwest. Some of them are going to be American troops coming out to protect settlers from Native Americans, and some of them are going to be cattlemen, okay? But as they move along the Transcontinental Railroad, they're going to start killing buffalo that play a key role in the culture of the Plains Indians. There's going to be a couple different conflicts that occur between the American settlers and the Indians. Okay, so one of those is the Sand Creek Massacre. Most of these wars and conflicts that occur start with Native Americans being on reservations, feeling like they're being too confined, so they raid the American settlers that are close by them. Okay, and then the American troops get involved, and there's usually some sort of battle that occurs. And oftentimes the Native Americans were not equipped to fight the U.S. troops, and so oftentimes they actually lost these battles. Okay, so the Sand Creek Massacre is one of the first ones. The Cheyenne raided American ranches in 1864. Okay, and so the U.S. Army offered them forgiveness if they returned back to their reservation. Now, this is the time of the reservation system, in which many Native Americans were placed on reservations and had to stay there. Okay, the Cheyenne returned to their reservation, where the U.S. Army, under Colonel Chivington, opens fire, killing about 150 Native American people. Okay. When the American people found out about the massacre, they were really upset. We had been treating Native Americans badly for years, and our legacy of that was not looking very good. Because Chivington has never actually punished for the massacre, though. So the Native American wars continue with the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Sioux were conducting raids against white settlers led by Sitting Bull, who was their tribal leader. Okay, the U.S. government orders them to stop, but they refuse. Okay, so the military invades the Sioux, and the Sioux are actually kill all the American military at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is a big victory for Native Americans. Many Native Americans had started doing what we call the ghost dance. Okay, and the ghost dance was a sacred ritual that had come about from a vision expressing that the buffalo would return and the whites would leave. Okay, the Indians were going to meet together to celebrate the ghost dance together at Wounded Knee when over 300 of them were killed. Okay, Americans again are outraged at the treatment of Native Americans. But the Wounded Knee Massacre notes the end of conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. Army. Native Americans had primarily been kept on reservations and will continue there. Okay. The American people are going to start enforcing a policy called Americanization. Okay, and Americanization is the idea that Native Americans should adopt American values, beliefs, practices, and just generally abandon their Native American identity. They're going to require Native Americans to attend American schools and start speaking English rather than their Native American tongue. Okay, they also passed the Dawes Act. Okay, and the Dawes Act is another effort to assimilate or Americanize Native Americans into mainstream American society. And they're trying to force them to give up their tribes, essentially, and become more individualistic like the rest of America was. Okay, and so they eliminate tribal ownership of land, they break up the reservations, and try to make the Indians into individual property owners. So lastly, one of the main things that occurs during the 1960s is the Frederick Jackson Turner's significance of the American frontier and American history thesis that he comes out with. And he essentially comes out with by saying that the American West and settling the land in the West has played a really key role in developing the American identity, right, as a part of the American dream. The American dream was the opportunity to have a better life, and the West and the frontier represented that dream for most Americans. And it was really the dream that made us more democratic and offered us this idea of individualism that the West promised. Farmers in the South and the West start becoming obsessed because they believe that railroads and big businesses are discriminating against them. And this is going to be a big deal, especially as we start getting into capitalism and the spread of American business. Okay, so these farmers form what we call the Populist Party, trying to unite farmers to improve their economic conditions and kind of stand up to the big men and the big businesses. Okay, and the populist farmers' goal overall was to increase the money supply. Okay, and they wanted to do this not by just having gold, but also allowing silver to be in the money supply. Okay, and silver would add to the amount of money that would be in circulation and hopefully give more people more money to buy products with. Okay, they also wanted to use the Interstate Commerce Act to regulate railroads and prevent discrimination against the smaller customers, such as the farmers. Okay, many of these railroad companies were giving out vouchers to big businesses to allow them to use the railroad for cheaper than the farmers, and the farmers really are the ones who needed the railroad to be cheaper for them. Okay. It also introduces what we call a cooperative. Okay, and a cooperative is an organization that reduces the cost of certain products. And these could be anything like from farm goods to seeds to fertilizer, anything that would help farmers out. But ultimately, the populist farming falls apart because there's a lot of division between the western farmers and the southern farmers, and the white farmers and the black farmers, and they're not able to create a united front. So as you finish up, go ahead and make sure that you've answered all of the guided questions. If you missed a question, make sure that you watch the video again and then pausing where you need to. If you feel like you have a good understanding of the video, go ahead and summarize what we have talked about in paragraph form, the main points of the video. And don't forget to use the specific vocabulary that is on your sheet, but also the bolded and underlined words. Okay, and then make sure that you ask one question, and that can either be a question that you have about the video or a discussion question that you would bring to class. Thank you so much for joining me for this video, the first one on the North Carolina Final Exam Review. We'll look forward to seeing you with the next video.